All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Super excited to have back on the podcast Sarah Peyton. Sarah, welcome.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, Guy.
All right. So Sarah joined us back on episode 260. She's a certified trainer of nonviolent communication, teaches people how language changes relationship in the brain. Sarah works with audiences internationally to create a compassionate understanding of the effects of relational trauma on the brain, and writes about and teaches people how words change and heal us. Her special interest is the way that difficult events impact our autonomic brain patterning and how to transform our tendencies towards self-criticism into self-worth. Her first book, Your Resonant Self, Guided Meditations and Exercises to Engage Your Brain's Capacity for Healing, is out. Sarah, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
All right. So let me tell you something. And I don't know if I shared this to you when I asked you, invited you back on here, but you're one of the people who, when I think of this podcast and when I think of what I'm hoping to do with this podcast, which is to really focus on the humanity, the relational aspect of engaging with someone, working with someone who's been impacted by trauma, and what that implies and infers and means really for the person doing that work as well as the client. You're one of the people that I think epitomizes this work. And so I mean that completely sincerely. So I'm super excited you're here.
Oh, I love your work too, Guy, and I'm very glad to be here.
Awesome. So let's start out with a quote. You said you had a quote that's going to launch us. What do you have for us?
I have the quote, "Let's be angry that rather than angry at." So the idea of beginning to move this, we're going to be thinking about Jaak Panksepp's work today with the circuits of motivation and emotion, and the way in which all of us have what's called a rage circuit. We all have the capacity to move into the life-serving energy of being able to say, in a way, no. So our bodies are mammal bodies, and they are equipped with 7 different circuits that Jaak Panksepp determined, and 8 if you count the 8th, which is a very interesting one, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this idea of anger as a life-serving force that is needed and necessary for all of us is hugely important when we begin to think about trauma and the healing of trauma. Because so often we, as little children, have experienced being impacted by other people's anger or rage in ways that were dangerous, and not even vaguely life-serving. So the idea that rage and anger can be a life-serving force is often almost mind-boggling for people who are trying to heal from trauma. And yet, if we don't reclaim it, we're leaving almost like we're leaving a swath of embedded trauma that's preventing us from accessing our life energy.
So having said that, if we may circle back to you're making the distinction between angry at or angry that.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah. So oftentimes when we're small, people have been angry at us, or they've been angry at our mother, or they've been angry at their mother, or they've been angry at a person, and they bring this rage in interpersonal relationship with words, with actions, with force. with damage to furniture, with damage to households, to pets, to people, to self. And so, of course, we would say, for example, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be an angry person. I'm not going to go there. I am not ever going to get angry. Many trauma survivors will have this almost as a promise to themselves, whether they can keep it or not, because of course anger breaks through. But then, of course, if they have this agreement with themselves, there's a terrible guilt about the anger having broken through. And if we begin to move toward an understanding that we can be angry that we can be angry that life has turned out this way, that we can be angry that that our boss is put in a position where he can't support us, if we can be angry that there's not enough money to pay the mortgage, if we can be angry that the world is set up in such a way that children don't get the opportunities that we want them to have. There's you're starting to feel this difference. It's an embodied sense of accessing protective force and advocacy.
Right. Okay. I'm shaking my head because I think I'm getting it. So in a sense, it's almost like you're making a distinction between being angry at someone or I'm angry at you for what you did, rather than angry at like the action that
angry that this happened.
Right. Okay. So that's a huge. It seems like a really big shift, and I can imagine what that would be like for someone, not only on the receiving end, but also someone who's working with that person. But you were talking about someone who's on the receiving end of that. So these distinctions are one of the things that I think so intrigues me about your work. How do you come? What draws you to this? How do you? I don't know. I'm just kind of fascinated with the whole process.
Well, most often what I'm doing is following some line of inquiry that comes from working with folks in my workshops, or the questions that they bring. So somebody will say, "What about anger? I don't ever want to be angry." And I'll think, wait a minute, I was just reading Yak Panksepp, and we've all got an anger circuit. What's happening for this person if they're never getting angry? What happens inside of them? What kind of life energy are they having to turn away from? How are they having to divert life energy? And this starts to get interesting here, because we have all of these different circuits of emotion and motivation. One of them is what Panksepp called the rage circuit. Another one is the circuit for when we really miss somebody who's important to us. So for little mammals, it's the panic circuit of like the missing mother. But that panic circuit for little mammals holds all of our grief and our shame emotions. It holds the emotions of what I call alarmed aloneness, which is the experience of, often we'll call it abandonment in English, but that word tends to imply that somebody has abandoned us. So what if we call it alarmed aloneness? Then we begin to kind of more clearly understand what's at play with our nervous system. And so, for example, you'll sometimes meet people, whenever they get angry, they start to cry. This takes us back to the work of Beatrice Beebe, which is also extraordinary work. And what her research shows us is that up until the age of 4 months, a baby has all the facial expressions that they're born with. They're born with all the human facial expressions: grief, anger, all the different levels and intensities of fear, of surprise, of happiness. And by the time we're 4 months old, we stop expressing the emotions that our mothers are not able to reflect. Wow. So if our moms are not able to reflect anger, it's already starting here that we're turning our life energy out of the anger circuit. Maybe she can be with us when we cry. So it's like we're channeling that life energy of anger into the grief circuit. And then every time we get angry, we find ourselves crying. And we're like, why the heck am I crying? I'm angry. I want to be able to access my righteous indignation, my power of advocacy. And instead, here I am with these tears springing out of my eyes. It's an entanglement of the circuits that comes from these early experiences. Or when we're talking about trauma and its effect on anger, if we had somebody who every time that they got angry, they were angry at us or at somebody that we loved, we start to have an entanglement of fear and anger. And every time somebody gets angry, then the fear circuit goes off. So it's like we stop. What trauma does to us is it makes our brain stop having choice, because the trauma ties brain functions and brain circuitry together in order to try to make the best plan for our survival. So it's like the brain believes, okay, every time somebody gets angry, I better get afraid because I want to be able to get my body out of here.
I think that that phrase, trauma prevents us or stops us from having choice. Let's kind of, if we can, kind of magnify that, and if you can speak about a little more what that means for someone what that might mean for someone who's experienced trauma, and obviously complex trauma, interpersonal trauma.
Sure. Well, one of the things that we know about trauma is that the amygdala has like a super glue power of memory. And it'll take everything that's connected with the original trauma and it'll glue it together. It's easy for us to see this with like flashbacks from war. A car backfires and somebody who was a soldier or lived in a war zone finds themselves diving behind a park bench before they even realize they've moved. Mm-hmm. The wiring is so intense. Loud, explosive noise, danger, must hide. That's something that's really familiar to all of us. But what we may not realize is on the emotional and motivational circuit level, that trauma will also tie things together. So we've talked about anger and grief being tied together, and anger and fear being tied together. But it's also possible we have a seeking circuit. And our seeking circuit is meant to take us through the world. It's what gives us curiosity. It's what gets us to finish our to-do list. It's what gets us to create the trauma therapist and get out there and bring a mission to the world. Our seeking circuit is an incredibly beautiful part of our being. But when it gets entangled by trauma, then it can kind of gum up the works quite extraordinarily. So if the seeking circuit gets entangled with the fear circuit, then every time we try to take a step in the world to realize our goals, there's like a level of fear that's present. So you're starting to see the gumminess that I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I can also see how this could be extremely helpful and almost empowering for someone who's experienced trauma to think that for one, oh my God, I have a rage circuit and a panic circuit and a seeking circuit, among others. And you're telling me that's why, first of all, I didn't even realize I had this. Right. And now you're telling me it's shut off or it's gummed up. Mm-hmm. No wonder why things are happening where I'm feeling this way.
Exactly.
So as a facilitator or a clinician, or speak from that vantage point, then how does that become helpful for?
Sure. Yeah. You can do it with bodies and you can do it with language. So I'll tell a story because I got a great story about doing it with bodies, and then I'll talk about how we do it with language. I was working with a woman who was 70 years old. And she sat down next to me in the workshop, and I said, what would you like to work on? And she said, I have been terrified all of my life. I've spent my whole life being terrified. I've never taken an unterrified breath. And I said, tell me a little more about this. And she said, well, there was a really hideous period of time when I was 3 years old. My mother went into the hospital. I had to stay with some people that really hurt me. And I was like, okay, let's take a look at this marriage of your 3-year-old self with the terror. So we invited somebody to stand up for the 3-year-old self and somebody to stand up for the terror so that she could see this, so that it made sense to her and it was outside of her own body. And she looked at this, and we worked for a little bit just acknowledging stuff and her telling the story. And as she was telling the story, the terror and the little girl began to separate a little bit. And I turned to her about 10 minutes in and I said, tell me, how are you doing? She said, I'm not scared. This is the first time in 70 years that I haven't been scared. And it was such a sweet, we worked for maybe 10 or 15 more minutes after that, just kind of tying up loose ends. But that moment was so lovely because once she knew she had a fear circuit and she understood why it had been on alert, and she understood there's something about healing trauma, I think, that always does this, that there's a separation in time of the person from the traumatic moment. Mm-hmm. When she's like, oh, it's my 3-year-old self that's terrified. I don't have to be terrified at the age of 70. That happened 67 years ago. Mm. Then there's a relaxation that comes into the body, and something very different starts to happen. One of the precepts of interpersonal neurobiology is that our brain always wants to heal, that it gets stuck in places, but there's a continuing sort of life force that's there trying to get through the stuck places. And the work that all of us do with trauma seems to really support that idea. Here's this woman going, oh my God, I'm not scared.
Had she been in therapy before at all?
She had been in therapy, yeah. It's like the experience of talking about rather than talking with is an interesting another quote that we could work with.
Yeah, but I think what you just talked about there, I mean, there's so many things going on there from my perspective. I mean, first of all, just in a very simplistic way, you're externalizing what happened by bringing these two other people and putting them out there and creating a relationship between it and her being over here. And that's pretty powerful in and of itself.
Yes.
So, wow, that's, I mean, after 70 years, this idea that she's able to finally be free from this, fear or...
And it was an entanglement of the circuits. You know, it was an entanglement in a way of the fear circuit with the sense of self. Without any clarity that the sense of self that the fear was entangled with was 3 years old and had very good reasons for being afraid.
Wow.
So the way that we could do this with language, if we don't, if we're not working with bodies in space, is, and this is really fun work, is to have a conversation with the circuits. Mm-hmm. We can start to invite, and some of the folks who do IFS will probably be really like going, oh yeah, I can see how this.
I was just going to say that.
Dialogue, yeah. So what happens when we dialogue directly with the fear circuit? What happens if we say, well, of course you're afraid. Of course you're on alert. Look at what happened to you. There's a directiveness. Mm-hmm. There's a relational connection with the parts of self that transforms trauma. So if you are with a therapist who's talking about it rather than talking to it, then you never get to have those direct conversations.
Say that again, if you will.
Yeah. So we can spend a lot of time telling the story of the trauma that happened to us. We can say, when I was 3, this happened. It was terrible. My mother went to the hospital. I ended up living with other people. They were terrible people. And there we are. That hasn't changed anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because, well, it may change things. The narrative therapy has a way of working with this so that the telling of the story can really be transformative. So I don't want to put any disrespect to narrative therapy. But there's something that happens in this like embodiment of the parts of our brain where we're giving them a voice that's similar to the woman sitting and looking at her fear circuit from the outside. The speaking directly to the fear circuit is a transformative act. It's an act of respect. It's an act of acknowledgement. It's like saying to the person in their brain, this makes sense. And it's giving the brain a chance to see that it doesn't have to be stuck.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like the amygdala creates a force field around a trauma experience. And the only way into that force field, the only way past the force field, is to begin to vibrate at the frequency that the amygdala is vibrating at in its holding of the trauma, which is also important to us in terms of those circuits, the circuits of emotion and motivation. If the amygdala is vibrating with grief holding this packet of information, and we're trying to vibrate at the level of fear, there's no completion of the circuit for the amygdala. The amygdala needs to be met in the brain zone that it's vibrating. The amygdalas, there are two amygdalas, one in the left hemisphere, one in the right hemisphere. They have different zones for different emotional experience. If you're having fear, energy and information is flowing through the amygdala at a different place than if you're having rage. If you're having rage, it's flowing through in a different place than if you're experiencing grief. So when we're talking to trauma, we're talking to amygdalas, and we need to have a sense of what emotional tone, which circuit needs to be spoken to first. One of the ways that I let people explore this is to think of a frozen moment, and then to ask themselves, in this frozen moment, am I afraid? Am I angry? Or do I feel terribly alone? Because those are the three emotional circuits that create frozenness. Those are when we go through the intensity of those three circuits, we'll end up in a dissociated or immobilized place. And so it becomes very interesting to say, what is the core, what is the emotional tone of this particular frozenness? Is it frozen rage? This is such an interesting question, because sometimes people will believe that it's all terror, that they're frozen with terror, but nothing changes, because they're sending a vibrational quality of like, is it terror? Is it terror? And the trauma bubble isn't changing, the force field isn't changing, because actually it's vibrating with rage, or it's vibrating with aloneness. Is this making any sense, Guy?
It is. It's sounding very intense, in the sense that what I'm feeling is that you're using, it sounds like you're using language in what feels to me like an embodied relational way. You're inviting the person to think about these different circuits, but along with that, there's going to be a somatic sense coming up.
Yes, and exactly this relational piece of the other person being able to say, well, of course, of course you were terrified. Of course you were alone. Of course there was an alarmed aloneness.
At what point, Sarah, obviously someone just doesn't sit down and you start asking these questions. How do you determine to to get in there. How does that work?
Well, with me, since I'm doing workshop work, but you can do it with client work as well. My question is always, what are you up against? What do you want us to, how do you want us to support you today? And I love it that you bring up the relational piece, because if we track back to Beatrice Beebe, we have this whole content area of trauma and the matching emotional tones that come into the relationality. But there's also something quite extraordinary that happens in conversations that's all about rhythm and timing, about how there is both a matching and a differentiation between the two people. And this is where we really, I think, enter the most often unconscious art of therapy, or the most unconscious art of working with trauma, is that there's an emotional tone that gets resonated with, that helps to dissolve the force field of that particular trauma. But there's also something incredibly relational and foundational that's happening in the movement of our faces together, in the timing of our heads moving together, the moments where we move into synchrony and the moments when we move out of synchrony. And the places where the gaps, like if I'm silent for too long, then there can be like a gap of a sense of not being accompanied that ends up being far less about emotional tone and far more about timing, rhythm, presence that's just right for the other.
Are you saying that those elements are unconscious? Is that what you said?
I said most often unconscious. There are folks who research these. Beatrice Beebe does research into this as well as into the faces of 4-month-old infants and their mothers. She also looks at what happens in a therapy session. What happens relationally between two people that are creating almost a fabric in which the healing can be held.
So as someone who's been doing this for a while, I mean, obviously to what degree does that just happen? Is that presence you talked about, or authenticity, or compassion, or vulnerability? Are those things that you consciously cultivate, and then when you're working with someone, they appear?
They appear. I think more it's about doing our own work. Because the more that we do our own work, the more that we move into the part of the nervous system that enables ease and fluidity and attention in relational connection. I was working with to come back to the circuits and then to integrate this. I was working with someone in a workshop where her circuit for seeking was entangled with grief because of the loss of her father. It's like when her father died, she didn't want to go forward anymore without him. She just wanted to stay with him, and any forward movement at all, any movement into the seeking circuit, any movement into doing, was a movement that took her away from her father, and she didn't want to leave him. So we did some of this conversation work with her seeking circuit, and in a way disentangled movement. Again, these small words are so beautiful. And disentangled movement toward from movement away from. so that she got to have a sense that she could move forward in her life without leaving her father, that he would still be with her as she moved. And after she did this little piece of work, this disentangling work, so that she could still move forward, it was so surprising to me. She turned and she looked at the audience. There were 80 people in the auditorium. And she looked at the audience and she said, "Oh my goodness, look at all these people. What beautiful faces." And she went and she got a chair and she sat behind me on the stage. She said, "Can I do this?" I said, "Of course." She sat behind me on the stage for the next hour and she just looked at all the faces. Our nervous system, when we have a sense of, when our circuits get disentangled, our nervous system can be fluid and responsive. And we get to move out of immobilization into engagement. So this is the work of Stephen Porges, beautiful work of Stephen Porges. When we're in the engaged place, social engagement, there's a fine feed from the facial muscles to the brain. When we're stuck in immobilization, the face collapses, the muscles of the face sag and become heavy. And we no longer have access to the mirror neurons that allow us to have the sweet interaction between faces that creates emotional engagement. And so there's a couple of things that are happening. When our facial muscles are engaged, the muscles of the middle ear tighten to the sound range of the human voice. When that happens, the eye muscles tighten so that we can see the human face. And the muscles of the larynx relax and support full emotional expression in the voice. And as soon as we start to get scared or angry or have a sense of alarmed aloneness, we lose all that fine feed. We're no longer in nuanced space. So this speaks to the importance of the therapist doing their own work. Because if the therapist's circuits are entangled and not moving fluidly, then the therapist is not able to be in responsive, fluid space and may be able to do the work of catching content, trauma content, but doesn't have the nervous system pieces in place to be able to weave that fine relational holding of the whole. I'm just going to check if I'm making any sense at all.
Yeah, you are. And I'm thinking to myself, you obviously have been doing this for a while, and the sensitivity that it sounds like you have to, be attuned to what's going on a relational level, on a verbal level, and at a somatic level. All these things are happening. I'm like, wow.
Yeah, this is why I say, it's largely unconscious for most of us. And for me, it's largely unconscious most of the time. I do know it's here, but... Right. But,
so,
yeah.
I mean, for those listeners who are out there going, "Oh my God, this sounds amazing. How do I learn about this? How can I could even imagine that some people are like, "Oh my God, I could never get to the point where I'm so attuned with the people I'm working with." But obviously, people can get there. What would you say? What would you recommend? How does someone kind of begin to sink their teeth into learning about these different things?
My book, Your Resonant Self, is a wonderful resource, and breaks this stuff down so that we can kind of makes it usable and experiential. If you love the nuts and bolts of the micro expressions and what happens in terms of attachment and this weaving of the fabric, that work is Beatrice Beebe's. I believe she's deeply extraordinary, and I can only read about a paragraph a month because it disturbs my attachment pain, and I just have to stop and mourn my own mothering, mourn all the years that I was with clients or people in workshops and didn't know, and so So Beatrice Beebe's extraordinary, difficult for me, difficult to read and extraordinary. And
I'll have that linked up at the show notes page.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
So your Resonant Self is your book, Beatrice Beebe, and also you mentioned.
I mentioned Stephen Porges, who has Dana somebody, and he have just published a book, Polyvagal Theory and Therapy, which will have a lot of this stuff quite beautifully expressed. I've just started reading it.
Go ahead.
Polyvagal theory. And then the other person I mentioned was Stephen Porges.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Stephen Porges was that. Sorry, the other person I mentioned was Jaak Panksepp. And he has died now, but his latest book was called The Archaeology of Emotion.
Okay. And correct me if I'm wrong, didn't you co-author several with Kathy Steele?
I'm not remembering.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we go, one of the things, Sarah, that again keeps coming up, there's a sense of empowerment that comes up for me in hearing about these different circuits and being able to see them in relation.
Yeah.
Myself, I'm putting myself in that position, being able to see, them being able to move apart and understanding how they're impacting me. So yeah, I just wanted to say that I really like things that are empowering.
Yeah, it's illuminating and takes us a whole new place, really.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Sarah, again, I'm excited to get this out there. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you for having me here.
You are welcome. Sarah Peyton's book is Your Resonant Self. I'll have this linked up again at the show notes page at thetraumatherapistpodcast.com. And thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.